Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce's Ukraine War Frontline update for the 21st of May 2023. Let's get straight to it. And you know it's mainly going to be about Bakhmut, let's face it. But nonetheless, we will take a quick trip to the northeast sector from Kupiansk to Kreminna, that axis going down north to south. And we'll start in the Kupiansk area and look a little bit at Adiivka. There have been some repelled attacks, apparently, according to the Russian MOD, of Ukrainians trying to take back Adiivka, but that's pretty much that for the area. Indeed, the ISW's Institute for the Study of War, US military think tank, says Russian mobile blogger claimed that Russian forces conducted assaults in the Serebryanska forest and advanced towards Adiivka. A Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces spokesperson Cherevati stated on May the 20th, so yesterday, the tempo of Russian assaults along the Kupiansk-Kreminna line has decreased over the past month from 5 to 7 daily assaults to 1 daily assault. That is really significant. I mean, it really is quite quiet along that axis. And of course, it says here that the Russians are claiming that Ukraine is attacked around Adiivka. So really nothing to report along this whole front line until you get down to sorry, my mouse has decided to stop working, until you get down to Kreminna area, and there has been some increase in territory that the Russians have gained around these meandering rivers or river, the Sversky Donets River, with its oxbow lakes there. Bit of geography for you. The Ukrainians, pro-Ukrainian mapper, Deep State Map, showed yesterday, and I missed this, that there's an increase in Russian territory there. They haven't updated their map in the last 24 hours. Just to give you some mapping updates. So I rely on a number of mappers to just try and work out what's going on, as well as random sources now and again. I try and feed that in. But for the pro-Russian mapping side of things, I look to Suryak Maps, who's fairly accurate. They are taking a break till the end of May. For the pro-Ukrainian mappers, Deep State Map is obviously very useful, but they have been, I don't know, not quite on it in terms of being as up to date as Suryak in the changing state of affairs in Bakhmut. And in fact, they've done no update in the last 24 hours. So it's going to be. I wonder whether my mapping will be as accurate as possible. I rely on others like Andrew Perpetua as well, but they don't obviously map every single day, or he doesn't map every single day. So we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, as we come further down south, past that activity in the Serebryanska forest, we come towards, as ever, Bakhmut. And just to remind you how my mapping works here, although there is no change apart from in the center of Bakhmut, really, center and slightly to the south. The yellow line is a pro-Ukrainian mapper, Deep State Map. That's the Russian line. The red line here is Suryak Maps. That's a pro-Russian map as the Russian line. And the blue lines as we get to the northern and southern areas of Bakhmut is Andrew Perpetua. And that flips from being over here being the Ukrainian line as we hit up here, Sako Ivansetti. This blue line becomes Andrew Perpetua's Russian line. So just the three mappers and what they think is going on. Now, in this northern area and the southern area of Bakhmut, there's actually been no change that I can see over the last 24 hours. There might have been change, but none of the mappers are reflecting that. And that is how it's been for the last 24, 48 hours in this area. Likewise, down south here in this area, there has been no change. There's been some change for actually as you come further up north towards Bakhmut, but I'll explain that in a second. So, has there been any Ukrainian gain of territory in these areas? Well, I said yesterday that these lines have probably stabilized due to the fact that Russia is piling in a whole bunch of reserves to this area from different areas of their front line elsewhere, Adiivka, Marinka, possibly. We have seen that the Ukrainian advances have somewhat stalled, but as I explained yesterday, that's not really a problem because you need to understand what the objectives of the Ukrainians are. So success should be measured against objectives. The question is, what is the objective here? Now, somebody challenged me to say, what do you mean their objective isn't to liberate this land? There are different levels of objectives. So the overall objective for the whole war is to get the Russians out of the whole of Ukrainian territory. But when you're taking a 10,000-foot view of what's going on here, what they want is the Russians to move their reserves into the Bakhmut area to fix those troops so that it leaves gaps elsewhere and a weakness elsewhere on the front line. Given that they haven't done a mass mobilization, this is hugely important. They have limited resources to throw around defensively all over the shop. So if they are worried about Bakhmut being encircled, yes, there might be success in the center of Bakhmut, but north and south being flanked and an encirclement of the Wagner, then they are going to see that as a huge PR loss. So they will send troops that really need to be defending elsewhere because there's a coming counteroffensive. This is exactly what the Ukrainians want. So they don't. Their objective here is to draw Russian troops in and to fix them, and ideally attrip them as well. And there was arguments. There's an argument I produced a source this morning in my news piece saying that actually Wagner lose more troops attritionally in the flanks out in the fields than they do in the center of Bakhmut. So ideally, the Ukrainians will want to do the fighting out here, where they can use mechanized equipment, machine guns, mines, artillery, and all sorts of stuff to take out the Russian troops. So what they want, their objective here is actually not to take land. Yeah, of course, eventually, and ideally, if it's possible, they'll take land as well. But their primary objective is fixing Russian troops and attriting them. Mainly fixing, then attriting. And down the list is actually liberating this land at the moment. Because actually, this, as Zaluzhny has previously said, the whole of Bakhmut is a shaping operation for the coming counteroffensive. So that if they can suck in and degrade Russian troops in that area, then that allows them to succeed elsewhere. Okay, so that's the situation. It's not really about taking land here. There will be an objective of defending against Russian attacks towards Chasiv Yar, but I don't think the Russians are in a position to be able to do that. The interesting situation now, given that Bakhmut has pretty much fallen into Russian hands, the question is what's going to happen next? Will the Russians just stop there and reconstitute? Well, it turns out that Prigozhin has announced that he's going to pull out within 5 days. So if we go to look at Bakhmut and the news about what's going on there, Wagner forces, let's go straight from the beginning. So Wagner Group financier Prigozhin has declared victory in Bakhmut yesterday and announced his intent to withdraw from the city on the 25th of May, so 5 days before withdrawing. Prigozhin claimed that Wagner Group forces completely captured the city yesterday, seizing the last multi-story apartment building in southwestern Bakhmut near the MiG-17 monument. That's where the last Ukrainian defenders were holding out. There are still some claims that there is some activity around there. Not too sure. Prigozhin announced that Wagner forces will establish defensive positions before transferring responsibility for the city to Russian conventional forces on May the 25th. There's lots of discussion around this point because some ultra-nationalists are saying that if Wagner pull out, that's basically desertion in a sense, and they can be done for treason. So all this infighting still going on. Prigozhin effectively stated that Wagner forces will conduct an operational pause by resting and restoring combat power at field training camps in unspecified areas, presumably far from the front line. ISW has not observed geolocated footage confirming claims of this publication. Ukrainian officials reported that Ukrainian forces are still fighting in a small section of southwestern Bakhmut as of May the 20th. Not sure that's the case. Malia, the deputy defense minister, stated that Ukrainian forces continue to hold positions near the MiG-17 monument as of yesterday. The Russian MOD has not commented on Prigozhin's claims or as of this publication, says the ISW. Now, Prigozhin's claimed victory over the remaining areas in Bakhmut is purely symbolic, even if true. And this is what I've been saying, that the kind of the victory of Bakhmut or taking Bakhmut is kind of meh to me. I really like unaffected. It's just a bunch of buildings. It has no intrinsic value. I mean, obviously so. Like, what value do these extra buildings here have? Like, really, what value do they have in and of themselves? They have value in being able to fix the Russian forces there and being able to trick the Russian forces, but they're still being fixed there by the flanking maneuvers, and that they're still being attrited, perhaps even more so in the flanks. Then the fact that Russia controls these buildings or doesn't control these buildings is neither here nor there. I mean, you've got to understand this. I'm tired of the pro-Russian voices on my thread saying, "Oh, listen to your cope." Yeah, even in light of the victory of the Russians over the town of Bakhmut, you're still saying this is a success for the Ukrainians. Well, yeah, like you listen to what I say and deal with what I say. Right. So, what is the point of the battle around here? What is the utility of these buildings? What is the utility of the fight around here? What are the Ukrainian objectives and what are the Russian objectives? So, you can have this being a success for both sides. So, on the one hand, this whole thing was a PR objective for Russia, and on the other hand, although the PR was important for Ukraine, it wasn't their primary objective. So, yeah, they might have lost like the PR battle over Bakhmut, but kind of like, so what? Really, the PR battle is about the Russian domestic audience. So that, yeah, whatever. It's about all the things I have already said. Right. Okay. ISW continues. Ukrainian forces continue pressuring Bakhmut's northern and southern flanks. However, as I've said there, no real news over the last 24 hours of any particular gains around there. So I think that has stabilized, but that may not be true. There's operational security. Who knows? Wagner forces are unlikely to successfully conduct a controlled withdrawal from Bakhmut while in contact with Ukrainian forces within 5 days without disrupting the Russian MOD's efforts to prepare for planned Ukrainian counteroffensive. So, if Prigozhin is being serious about pulling out Wagner within 5 days, that's actually going to screw the Russians up in this larger understanding of what's going on these front lines. So you have then the Russian MOD having to pull in reinforcements to help shore up the lines both in and around Bakhmut, which weakens them everywhere else. And if Wagner then going to say, and not only that, we're pulling out to reconstitute, which I would argue they definitely need to do, right? They must be exhausted, must have nothing left. They have no regard for their convicts. They just send them in to die. But some of the kind of more valued Russian soldiers in the Wagner regiments, I mean, they all will need to reconstitute and rest. But that will present further problems for the Russian MOD because they will have to then supplant those troops in and around Bakhmut, therefore needing to draw them from elsewhere. They're unlikely to establish adequate defences or consolidate recent gains in Bakhmut sufficient to forestall Ukrainian counterattacks by May the 25th, even if his announcement of Wagner's withdrawal is true. Ukrainian forces are still in Kreminna and Ivaniska and are engaging Russian forces in and near Bakhmut. Ukrainian artillery can still target Russian forces in and around Bakhmut. Withdrawal in contact with the enemy is an exceedingly difficult task. So, literally removing yourself while being attacked, both on the ground and by artillery and drones, is tough. And you are not going to be taking casualties off of the enemy, but you will be taking casualties yourselves. Conducting a relief in place while in contact is also an extremely challenging maneuver that Russian forces. So not only that, but then when you are replacing those troops with other troops, you're just kind of moving a lot of troops around. That's dangerous because troops are now out in the open and artillery can take its toll. Wagner units have shown poor coordination with Russian conventional forces and other irregular formations subordinated to the Russian MOD and the Russian military command. Factors that all would hinder a smooth relief in place operation. The Russian military command is unlikely to generate sufficient forces to relieve Wagner in Bakhmut and hold its flanks within the window Prigozhin has announced without redeploying Russian forces from other areas. And that's the point. Prigozhin's statement of his intent to withdraw could be a crude attempt to mislead Ukrainian forces into conducting a counterattack through Bakhmut city. So this could be a psyops operation. They might not be intending to withdraw at all. We've heard before Prigozhin's threats, often threats to the MOD, but this could be a kind of veiled feint, if you like, to try and draw in Ukrainian attacks. Russian conventional forces likely will still need to transfer additional forces to Bakhmut direction, even if Wagner mercenaries remain in Bakhmut. So that's the synopsis of the situation, as according to the ISW, Institute for the Study of War. The war map here states, a war mapper themselves state that 6 months, because a map can't talk, right? 6 months after street battle. See, this is a problem when I speak. Being a philosopher, and words are really important. And I question everything I say all the time. I've got my non-conscious brain kicks out these words, and my conscious brain is vetting them all the time. And sometimes things get missed, but quite often I'm questioning every sentence. And it's like, no, a map can't talk. I have to change that. So anyway, sorry. 6 months after street battles began, Russian forces have occupied the city. I'd say, well, 6 months after street battles, but 12 months after the first shell hit Bakhmut. Um, Taking the last Ukrainian stronghold in the west, Ukrainian troops may still hold some buildings in the very southwest as the last of their troops withdraw. And then we have Poulet-Volant's map here suggesting that there's still pressure north in the northern areas from 4 different positions, and then in the south from a couple of positions. But there's no exchange of territory, and the Russians are pushing back in the south and still pushing in the center there. The pro-Russian source Rebar says of the whole situation, and now very much calling Bakhmut Artyomovsk. After the flight of the 60th and 93rd SMBRs, as well as 241 brigades of the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine from the southwestern outskirts of Bakhmut, the assault detachments of Wagner completely liberated the city. Until May the 25th, the territories will be cleaned from the presence of Ukrainian formations. Despite the long-awaited success, the situation at the front is only approaching the active phase. The armed forces of Ukraine lost tens of thousands of people during the defense of Bakhmut and Vuhledar, but parts of the strategic reserve were not involved. This is Rebar being sort of quite honest about what's going on here, whilst also trying to sell this as a victory to Russia. This is, some clever writing from Rebar. They are saying they're not talking about the losses Wagner have had and the losses the DPR and the Russian conventional forces have had. Of course, they're saying Ukraine have lost tens of thousands. This is a victory. However, and this is the truthful part, which is, yeah, okay, what's going on now strategically, and Ukraine have not used their strategic reserves. So in these sort of localized counterattacks, and basically in the defense of Bakhmut itself, yes, they've been using consistently rotating, but they haven't been dipping into the troops that have been trained abroad, that are being getting ready for the counteroffensive, and that is significant. And Rebar recognise this. Now, new formations of the 9th and 10th Army Corps are in the rear areas and are preparing for an attack. The radio intercepts of the members of the armed forces of Ukraine noted the 3rd decade of May as a possible start of the offensive. So we're into that 20th to the 30th of May. And Rebar seems to suggest that there could be a counterattack, a larger counterattack around Bakhmut. I don't know whether that's the case. I don't know whether they'll keep trying to prod and probe using existing forces while the major counteroffensives take place elsewhere, but all of those Russian reserves have been drawn into Bakhmut. In recent weeks, artillery units have been preparing guns for intensive shelling, and ammunition has been brought to warehouses. And at the tactical level, combat orders have already been sent out. Bakhmut Artyomovsk is liberated, and this victory will go down in history as one of the largest battles. And it is a fall that can become a catalyst for the start of the long-awaited offensive of the armed forces of Ukraine. So, actually, not dwelling so much on how wonderful this is, Rebar, could have been saying this is one of the largest battles, what a victory it is for Russia. I think there's a realization that this is a bit of an embarrassing victory. It's taken it a year to achieve, and actually the Russians have been exhausted in doing so. I think Rebar realized that. Rebar are critical enough at times to let you know that, yes, they are a mouthpiece for the Kremlin, but you can't hide from reality that much. Sometimes reality comes and slaps you around the chops and wakes you up to what's really going on. And Rebar are sometimes, cognizant of that. Taking into account the flank attacks of the armed forces of Ukraine near Artyomovsk, near Bakhmut, The accumulation of formations in the Zaporizhia and southern Donetsk regions, as well as in the Kupiansk-Kreminna direction, it is there that the main attacks of the enemy should be expected. I would agree with that, and yeah, so I think that's a quite a level appreciation of what's going on, given that it's rebar. Um, yeah, and I said this earlier today in my news video. Andrew Perpetua saying Russia has finite men and resources. Their armor and ammo reserves are rapidly depleting, and while they can still field their forces recklessly today, they will not be able to do so for much longer. The rate of losses are just too colossal. They spent a year trying to capture Bakhmut or capturing Bakhmut, which they still haven't finished, by the way, according to him. But again, this was 22 hours ago. And now air power is being committed to Ukraine. The air power, in my opinion, represents a tidal shift in the balance of power. Russia had to achieve some major victory prior to it arriving. They barely captured one small and meaningless city, losing all of their initiative in the process. They can barely even assault in two places at the same time anymore. They have taken small forest strips around Adiivka as their secondary offensive, and now they're transferring forces from around Ukraine into Bakhmut because they fear losing its flanks to Ukrainian forces who, even with these Russian reinforcements and without significant Ukrainian reinforcements or assets, are still advancing. Uh, True. Okay. So, Syriac Maps says that we saw gradually yesterday this increasing territorial advance, I guess, from the Russians as they pushed the Ukrainians out of the last areas of these western suburbs. There was still the southwestern buildings there that the Ukrainians were hanging on to, and they were being flanked in Kromova. So it's going to be interesting to see what Ukraine do around Kromova, because now that if the Ukrainians aren't attacking in this area of the town because they don't want to be just sat out in fields while the Russians are within, the protection of these buildings, it's just be sitting ducks here if the Ukrainians were to continue attacking in that direction. So then these troops can concentrate more on helping out on this flanking area. So they have taken the land here. In fact, it's grown since then. But there's, one wonders whether the Ukrainians will be in a little bit of trouble on that area of the flank. So anyway, as we come down here, Syriac Maps shows the overall situation of what's going on in Bakhmut, and then that they took this area indeed of going towards Kromove or of Kromove, and the Ukrainians pulling out here. So current situation west of Bakhmut. Ukrainian army continue withdrawal towards Ivanitska town. That's further to the south. Meanwhile, Russian army began combing operations in Kromova, which was vacated by Ukrainians, which retreated towards the trench area north of it. And then it goes on to talk about Adiivka. But just to mention sort of their kind of analysis of the whole, now that Bakhmut is kind of over for the time being, as far as the building to building warfare, that's why I'm dwelling a little bit on it today. The Battle of Bakhmut is over, says Syriac Maps, pro-Russian mapper, being for the moment the most costly battle of the Russian-Ukrainian war. These 9 months of fighting, advancing and retreats have cost the lives of many soldiers on both sides. On the other hand, the degree of destruction of the city is high, and its reconstruction is not contemplated in the near future. It's very possible that the city will recover in its old Soviet name, changed in 2016 due to the Ukrainian nationalist policy. I reported yesterday on Syriac doing some kind of they tweeted about it's now going to be called R2 Mosque, and yeah, blah, yada yada yada, and then they deleted that tweet because it was pretty. It really showed you Syriac Maps for who they are, I think. However, history is written by the victors, so the Russians are likely to make the change feasible. This is kind of a more measured approach. With Bakhmut taken, the next phase for the Russian side will be to expand the buffer zone around it, which implies a continuation of the offensive towards the canal zone and on the outskirts of Chasiv Yar. It's not known if Wagner will participate in it after carrying the full weight of the Bakhmut operation, or if it will take a break after this success. And there's a question, will they carry on to Chasiv Yar? Do they have the capacity to do that? I don't think so. However, the possible operation to take the city is not contemplated in the near future, as the Ukrainian positions are more advantageous and defensible in case of a Russian attack. What is more feasible is a continuation of the war by attrition by the Russian side, making small advances with a view to retaining as many Ukrainian troops in the region as possible. So this is seeing this from the other point of view, which is the Russians attriting and fixing Ukrainian troops. It's kind of projection, isn't it? That's what you're saying is happening with us. Well, we're going to say that's happening with you. On the other hand, the resistance and tenacity of the Ukrainian side has been commendable, capable of facing Wagner's PMC and the Russian artillery potential. Since March, the troops have avoided the operational encirclement of the city by maintaining the two supply routes and intermittently sending reinforcements. Even a small offensive carried out in recent days has relieved the pressure on these routes and the final withdrawal of its soldiers. The resistance has allowed the Ukrainians to gain time to prepare the offensive towards the Sea of Azov, although only time will tell if the effort and wear and tear has been worth it. What does seem clear is the Battle of Bakhmut has not been a turning point for any side, and the war is still far from over, unfortunately. I think that last sentence says it all. And indeed, what it says before there is really significant because actually, what the Ukrainians did in losing Bakhmut was a very long and successful operational withdrawal. Successful by point of fact that they weren't encircled, that these two roads were still to differing degrees operational until the very end. Particularly, Kreminna was obviously cut off within Bakhmut, but they lost it a little bit and then regained it. This allowed them to cede territory slowly, always attriting the Russians, and of course they were losing troops themselves, but they were never encircled and cut off, and they pulled out successfully from Bakhmut. So in a sense, this was one very long operational withdrawal. You remember we were talking about how they were using the river as a line, then this road, and then just gradually pulling back, the railway, so on and so forth, and until they got to here, and they're out of Bakhmut pretty much. There you go. You can. I'm not trying to sell that as a success, to try and glorify Ukraine, but as far as a withdrawal from a city goes, that's a fairly successful one. Um, Russians now control it. What happens next? So this is the area, as you can see, when we get into the center of Bakhmut, the blue line then goes back to being what, in this case, where the Russian lines were yesterday. So it's not Andrew Perpetua's line here. This is where the Russians were yesterday. This is what was lost to the Russians as according to Syriac maps. So you've got not only this area to the north, and then to a little bit towards Kreminna, and you might have no Russians in Kreminna now. No Ukrainians, sorry, in Kreminna now. I don't know what the situation is. There could be tough battles for that today. But you've got, Syriac maps claims that the Ukrainians have vacated it already. Then you've got this whole area, and even going further down south towards the fighting in Klishchivka, it appears that the Ukrainians have lost ground in this area here. Then, at about this point, the blue line shifts to being Andrew Perpetua's Russian lines, right? So don't think that this is all area that Ukrainians have lost. This is the area that Ukrainians have lost, and then at this point, the blue line switches to being the Russian lines here, as according to Andrew Perpetua, and they are unchanged in the last, well, really 48 hours. Whether that is actually the case, I don't know. None of these mappers have changed anything around here, particularly. Syriac maps changed a little bit there, but that's it. Yes, and that was yesterday, not today. So there we have it. That's Bakhmut for you, as according to all of those different sources. I did dwell on that a little bit because of its significance, certainly for the Russians. Flags of the Wagner PMC and Russia being hoisted all across Bakhmut. So they are kind of trumping about this. This is, they see this finally as a big success. And, these guys have been fighting for a long time over this territory, and now they have it. So, this is for them personally, these individuals, this is their victory moment, right? However, this is how some people see it. There are going to be a few memes going around, I guess, today, but it's like what they think the capture of Bakhmut means. I think that's quite an amusing interpretation of the map. Bakhmut is everything. Now we can take the whole of Europe. And it's interesting seeing, if you just put Bakhmut into Twitter and just see what people are saying about it. One interesting thing I do find, and other people have made this comment, this isn't my actually finding, but it's confirming what other people are saying, which is many pro-Russians. There's a larger proportion of pro-Russians that have paid for the blue tick to Twitter and to Musk, and this gives a larger amplification. So you're paying basically $8 a month, and you're allowed longer tweets, and they get amplified more. So loads of pro-Ukrainians have said, "Oh, I'm not going to do that," and loads of sort of Western media personalities have said, "I'm not doing this," and loads of Russians saying, "Yeah, we're going to do that." You're wondering whether the payment comes from the Kremlin, so you start looking down here, and all the pro-Russians, Spriter here is quite a prevalent one. Blue tick. This will get amplified around. Bakhmut will be the first major victory in history where the private military company defeated an organized army trained and supplied by the collective West. Thomas Tyner there saying his piece. Actually, Thomas Tyner says a comparison to help you understand how strategically irrelevant Bakhmut is. Imagine an invader taking 10 months and suffering 70,000 casualties and take 98% of the Grand Prairie in Alberta, Canada. If you've never before heard of the Grand Prairie in Alberta, exactly. No one had heard about Bakhmut 10 months ago either. It's because both cities are strategically irrelevant. If an invader takes Grand Prairie, all he takes control is that one city. Grand Prairie doesn't open the way to Ottawa or Toronto, doesn't cut Canada in half. It's just a city where the invader decided to waste his troops by the thousands. Bakhmut is a symbolic battle and one that will be remembered forever, but the smart Ukrainians got the Russians to waste their troops in the strategically most stupid place in all of Ukraine. That's how Thomas Tyner sees it, and you get others. Here's another blue tick Russian saying Bakhmut was taken by a restaurateur and some convicts against an army trained and supplied by US and NATO. Of course, that's kind of really bastardizing the actual reality of what happened there. Okay, as we go down to Avdiivka, we'll see what has happened there. So that's a bit further south. Sorry to have spent so long on Bakhmut, but it is a fairly significant day, I guess. We have Adiivka, again, not really any territorial exchanges going on. In fact, that's the case for the whole of the rest of the front line, really. Well, I'm going to tell you something that one of the mappers has changed soon. So Novokolonyove, Stepova, that's to the north of Adiivka, Adiivka itself, Severny, Pervomaisky to the south, and then further south to Novomykhailivka. There are repelled Russian attacks, as according to the General Staff. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces unsuccessfully attacked Pervomaisky and Nevelsky, but advanced the railway north of Avdiivka from Krasnohorivka. So that represents this. This is a railway here that comes along, cycles around to the north of Krasnohorivka. And yesterday I did a change here that both Suryat maps and Deep State map indicated. And in fact, Suryat maps, they changed it on a map and I adapted their map to show that change, but they didn't really talk about it actually until today where they mention it. Where are they? There they are. So the map that they change is this. That's the area there that the Russians appear to have taken some control of, a small area of territory there. But other than that, nothing too significant. And that was 2 days ago rather than being yesterday. Another Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces made several successful advances in the Donetsk direction in the past week, but the Russian forces have stabilized the front near Krasnohorivka. That's where we were just talking about. There's no detail there in ISW about where the Ukrainians have advanced. The General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled over 20 ground attacks in the Marinka area. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Malia reported the Ukrainian defenses in Marinka forced Russian forces to attack on the northern and southern flanks instead. Okay, so we're going to go to Marinka now, further down south here. Now, in Marinka, we haven't seen footage of the destroyed pieces of kit that were somewhere back here in the Petrovsky area, the 10 T-90s and whatnot that were taken out supposedly by HIMARS a couple of nights ago. There's no footage of that yet. I assume it happened, but it might not have happened as claimed. And then Marinka, lots of activity going on in Marinka. Now, the mapping changes, and ISW talked about how they're concentrating on the flanks because they're not getting success in the center. There's been no mention of this, but suddenly Suryat maps has changed to having part of Pobjeda now under Russian control. I've not seen that mentioned anywhere else. That could be that kind of talk here about attacks on the flanks to the south and north of Marinka. Pobjeda is super important for allowing the Ukrainians to maintain this defensive line. If they lose Pobjeda, then Marinka is able to be flanked and they'll lose the rest of Marinka, no doubt. So Pobjeda is super important. There are loads of entrenchments, I think, around this kind of general area. You've got this, I think, is agricultural buildings, as according to Syriac maps, is taken, but there's no mention of that. There's no discussion of that anywhere. It's just a change in mapping. So perhaps that has happened, perhaps it hasn't. And other than that, we've got pretty much uh, very little happening apart from, I believe, an attack towards Droznyanka, south of Philippine, according to the ISW, the Russian MOD, claiming that there is attacks there. There's a lot of talk about Mariupol being here. I talked about that in my news piece this morning about storm shadows, although some people say it could be ground-launched small diameter bombs and not the UK provided cruise missiles. But yeah, so that's really that. Now, as far as I'm getting ahead of myself. That's as far as the Zaporizhia area is concerned. Not too much activity, perhaps some in Droznyanka. Now, as far as Kherson is concerned and the Dnipro River, I showed you this video this morning of these riverine boats being used, and you've got a couple of different craft. You've got some of them look like landing craft. They've got guns on board. They got people. This is just kind of PR training video. Those aren't real Russians, I don't think. If they are, they're very polite and well equipped Russians. Yeah, but this is kind of showing, I guess, what Ukraine could do, and the fact that they do have these riverine boats that we know the US has given them a bunch of. Well, then we have this in the ISW. The Washington Post reported on May the 19th that Ukrainian commander of the operational group of Kherson troops, Brigadier General Drapati, stated that Ukrainian Special Operations Forces conduct raids in the east left bank of Kherson Oblast, but that the Ukrainian forces do not hold stable positions there. He reportedly added that Ukrainian assault units train twice a week for operations to cross the river using boats and pontoon bridges. And the Washington Post reported that Ukrainian forces have begun constructing pontoon bridges that could be used to transport heavy weaponry across the river. He reportedly stated that Ukrainian forces may use islands in the Dnipro River Delta to launch operations on the east bank, and claimed that Ukrainian forces control 90% of the islands through physical, visual, and artillery means. So it might not be that they actually have troops on them, but they control them because the Russians can't be on them because they're hitting them with artillery. He reportedly highlighted the fact that Russian forces are worried that Ukraine is preparing for active operations in the Kherson direction, that they have recently begun fortifying their defenses in the rear and planting more mines on the east bank. So that is to suggest that the Ukrainians are perhaps readying themselves for some kind of offensive across the river, or is that just a feint to fix Russian troops there while they concentrate elsewhere, a bit like in Bakhmut? And the final thing I want to say today, it regards some of the top generals, top commanders in the Ukrainian army. There were claims recently, and I reported that myself, that the Russians had hit some vehicles and a command post in the Chaziv Yar, towards Chaziv Yar, and that this has taken out top Ukrainian commanders. Interestingly, we haven't heard from some of these commanders since then, so that probably doesn't help these rumors going around. I think Tantsura was killed. I think that was admitted, I thought, by the Ukrainians. So Malyar, the deputy defense minister, stated that information operations allege that Russian strikes have recently killed Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces commander Tantsura, Ukrainian Eastern Grouping of Forces commander Syrsky, so he's the one in charge of Bakhmut, and Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Zaluzhny. Prigozhin has amplified this information operation, alleging that Zaluzhny might be dead, and he said that yesterday. Now, Zaluzhny, to be fair, doesn't really come out into public very often. He's only had a couple of interviews, and that's why those have been quite significant. There's a YouTube interview, or YouTube that's uploaded to it, an interview that's uploaded to YouTube recently, but also his one he did with The Economist. But he's not really in the public eye a lot, so that we haven't seen or heard from him, I don't think is particularly important. Syrsky does turn up, and he does comment a lot, and we haven't heard comment from him for some time. So actually, that is a worry. And Tantsura is a lesser known one, but I when that happened, I think he was one that was killed, unless that was someone else. There was a couple of people who were mentioned. Anyway, that is a worry, something to keep an eye on. These sort of things will happen, but if they are as big as Zaluzhny and Sursky, then that is a massive issue for the Ukrainians. Has that happened? I'm not saying it's happened. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I don't know. I doubt it. Russians are big on disinformation. However, you could disprove that very easily by saying, "And here they are." So, yeah, I'd be interested to see what you guys think about that. Anyway, thank you for watching this. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all of your support. This has been a longer one because of the nature of Bakhmut now being in hands, I think, of the Russians. Let me know what you think about that as well in the comments below. Thank you. Take care. Speak later.